Hi there, I'm Vicky. I'm glad you're here. Today I'm going to be watercolouring this beautiful stamp called Prized Peony from Stampin' Up, and using one of the sentiments on the front of the stamp set, probably this one here. It has some really nice words on it. Your sweet friendship refreshes the soul. I think it would be lovely for inside the card. For the watercolour panel, I'm going to be using Fabriano Studio Watercolour, which is a hot press paper, 25% cotton, 300 GSM or 140 pounds. So hot press watercolour paper works really well when you have a stamp that you want to get a fine impression. So the card I'm making is based on this lovely cardstock. This is Sahara sand. I think it's very similar to Neenah Desert Storm, but it's a beautiful sort of greeny grey colour, and it works beautifully with the colours I'm going to be using. Now, I've done a colour swatch, and I recommend you do some planning before you head straight into colouring your card. This is what I'll be colouring on, and you can see how nicely that goes against that Sahara sand background. This is by Stampin' Up, this paper. So I'll run through the colours that I'm using. I'm using my Winsor Newton professional watercolour paints, and I'm using 4 colours. So we have Rose Opera, Alizarin Crimson, Permanent Sap Green and Black. And I've used these colours in varying shades and strengths and blended them together to see how they blend. And I love the colours. This colour in particular works really well. This is the green, permanent sap green with the black. Look how well it works against that Sahara sand colour. And this pink here is a lovely pink too. This is pink with a little bit of black in it. So this is the Rose Opera, which is here and here, different strengths. This is black. This is permanent sap green. You can see how the different strengths, alizarin crimson, give you different colours. So out of 4 colour paints, I can get a whole gamut of beautiful, beautiful watercolour colour. So I'll show you those colours on my swatch book here. So they're in their full strength. Opera Rose, Alizarin Crimson, Permanent Sap Green and Ivory Black. So they're the colours I'm using. Alizarin Crimson has cool undertones. Opera Rose has warm undertones. Permanent Sap Green undertones are warm. And of course, Ivory Black is neither warm nor cool. It is just a pure black. Now, I've lined up a few things I'm going to be using. I've already used my bone folder to score the card. I have used a paper trimmer and trimmed all my pieces down so that they work perfectly. So this is a regular card front. I've trimmed down the watercolour card so that there is a really nice border around the outside. Then I've used that same shape to create a template for the inside piece. And the reason I put an inside panel in is because if you put watercolour paper on the front, you add your foam tape to adhere it, and you don't have something on the back, it makes the card want to flop over rather than stand up on a shelf. So to give it a bit more weight, I just put this layering piece in. However, that's entirely up to you, but I do prefer to stamp on this and layer it in so that it gives the same little border around the outside as the front. So that's quite nice. You could also use another piece of watercolour paper inside to create that. However, watercolour paper is much more expensive than cardstock, so I think this is a good affordable option. So the other things that I'm going to use, I obviously have this double-sided tape which will adhere the panel. I have some masking tape. This is ZQ tape, and I bought this from my local dollar store. It was $2, and it is by far the best masking and cheapest masking tape I have used. It's very low tack, so if I peel it off, you can always test when you buy these. If you put your thumb under it or your finger under it, and you can pull it away quite easily, that means it's a very low tack. That's what you want, because you don't want this to tear your beautiful watercolour paper. The other things that I have ready, I have my embossing powder. I'm going to emboss this image in Silver Pearl Embossing Powder by Ranger. Now, if I show you the colour of this, let's see if you can see that. The colour of this powder is very, very close to the card. It's not a white powder, it's a lovely soft colour. So let's see how that embosses with some Versamark watermark ink or watermark ink. I have a powder tool ready to clean the card so that there are no fingerprints on it, and I'm going to get started making this card now. I have my heat tool ready. I'm going to turn that on and have it ready. So when you get Stampin' Up stamps, this is how they look in the case. You can put the stickers on the back of them. However, if you want them to cling to your stamp positioner and to an acrylic block, the simplest way is to just peel the backing off. And I don't throw this away. This can make a really good mask for some of your images if you need something that will mask the image while you're stamping. It is bigger than the shape of the image, but I have kept these and used these before and found them very helpful. Powder tool. Pick up your stamp, add Versamark. Now I've just re-inked this with my refill so it's nice and juicy. And now I'm going to sprinkle the embossing powder onto my card. So I'll bring that up a bit closer so you can see what a great colour to work with watercolour card. It's so nice. I'm using 3 brushes today. This is a Golden Maple No. 6 round watercolour brush. Comes to a beautiful fine point. You can get some quite fine details with a brush this size. However, this is going to be what I use to do the very loose, light background wash in this very, very soft grey, which is the black with lots of water. Then the other 2 brushes I have are Princeton brushes. I have a 0 brush, which is tiny. You can see how small that is. And I have a size 2 brush, which is a little bigger. So for the really fine details, I'll be using the 0. And for most of the painting of the peony, I will be using the size 2. Opera Rose, Permanent Sap Green, my black, and my Alizarin Crimson. And this is where they sit on my palette. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the Opera Rose because that's the colour I have on my brush. I have a paper towel ready to wipe off any excess water, and I'm going to start with the petals. Now watercolour paint always dries lighter than when you first put it down, so this looks quite vivid. It will dry back to a softer shade. And I'm just going to colour all the petals loosely, because whatever paint lands on top of the embossing powder will just wipe off, because the embossing resists the watercolour paint. And I can do some blending while that is still wet. So I'm going to bring in my Alizarin Crimson. So that is this darker pink here. You can see how dark it is if I don't add too much water there. It can be quite a dark pigment, which is nice. I'm going to bring that in and just drop in a little colour where I can. Adding some water so that it will flow and blend. And I'm not even being too particular about the shadows here. Because it is embossed, the shadows will read as the embossed ink. All I really want at this point is to get some variation of lights and darks. Not really paying too much attention to where the shadows are. It's not important when you use this type of method. Now it's going to be darker in certain spots that have the ink on them, so I'm just going to add some stippling to the embossed part. I love to stipple these images. If you've watched any of my other videos, stippling is one of my favourite techniques in watercolour painting. And I'm going to do the little blossom here as well while I have these colours out. I'll start with pink. And I go right to the edge. And then bring in some Alizarin crimson again. And just lay some pigment in, wet on wet. It's so pretty. And I'm going right over the embossed ink, over the top of it. And even slightly outside, just very slightly outside the lines. So there's an outline of colour that's quite solid. Now I'm going to start on the stem, but I'm not going to let it come close to the pink. I'll stop before I get to those pinks because they're not dry yet. Okay, now for the greens. So I'm going to bring in my permanent sap green, which is this one here. And I'm going to do some lighter wash to begin with. And I'm using my size 2 brush. And I have this on my palette over here, so I'll move some of the green over here. And start on the leaves. So allow some of it to go slightly outside of the lines, but just slightly. All right, now this has started to dry really quite nicely, and you can tap it and I can see that that's dry. So I'm going to bring in some more colour in with the pinks. And I'm going to mix up some of this colour here, which I really like, which is the pink with a little touch of black to it. So we're going to use the Opera Rose, and I'm going to mix it with some black over here. To get that nice colour that I really like. Get a much deeper hue. So this is a lovely shaded colour. A little more Opera Rose. There we are. So that's really deepening the tones beautifully. And now I'm going to bring this in and I'm going to have a look at where it's darker. So I can see this petal folds up. So from under there, I'm adding some darker, just around the edges. Not filling in the entire shape, just the edges. And going over some of those embossing lines too, to give some detail. Just looking where the shadows are, and laying down some colour. Now I'm going to use some of this colour that I came up with here, which is like a pinky brown, because I've added the alizarin crimson to the sap green to create this lovely tonal colour here. So I'm going to mix that up on my palette. So I'm going to take some of the alizarin crimson, which is here, and I'm going to bring this across and mix this with some of the sap green. It's going to give a lovely browny green colour. And I'm going to bring that back into the stems to give them a secondary shade. See how it makes that beautiful browny green? Oh, it's delightful. Okay, just tap that in. In the shaded areas. I like this colour so much, I'm going to drop a little pigment into the very centre to bring it up into the flower as well. So we don't have one colour in the flower and a different colour in the stems. We want that travelling around the painting. And I talk about this a lot with my watercolours, that you want the colour to travel. You can see how that already has given a centre to the peony and has brought in that brown from this part of the painting further up. So I like that a lot. I'm just dabbing a little more here and there, just dropping it in, just very small amounts. Now while that's drying, I'm going to stamp the inside of the card with this lovely sentiment, your sweet friendship refreshes the soul. So I'm going to use Versamark Onyx Black ink for this. Perfect. And I'm going to adhere this to my card with some Tombo multi-adhesive, which is my favourite glue for this purpose. And now I want to add this very pale grey background, which is just black with lots of water added. And I'm bringing in a white china plate so that I can see the amount of black that I'm using. I'm going to have this very, very thin wash. I don't want a whole lot of pigment in there. I want it to be mainly water. And I'm going to test it out on here first. Not really wet enough yet. It requires quite a lot of water for this wash. I'm trying to match to this one, and that looks like the ticket. Right, we're there. Okay. I'm going to start with some water, just clean water in the background, and then I'm going to drop this pigment into it, which is already quite watered down. Okay. See how subtle that is? This is the wet on wet technique. Clean water and then drop in a very fine amount of very watered down black paint. Clean water. Now add pigment, just drop it in. Very watered down pigment. Clean water. Drop in pigment. And this helps the image to not float on the background. I recommend a white china plate for all your colour mixing. Really, it's a very economical way of having a palette. The watercolour paint doesn't bead up on ceramic palettes either, so you can actually see the colour that's going to come through on your work. Okay, and let this dry. And now I'm going to bring in that backing piece from the flower and lay it over the top. So I can do some splashes in the background. So I'm just going to lay it on top and do some of these nice splashes here. So I'm going to use my big brush for this. And I want the splashes to be black and a little bit of green in there as well. This colour here, which has a slight green, which will bring up the colour of the card. So it's not completely black or grey, but it's going to be nice and wet, really, really wet. Adding some more water to that, get it nice and sloppy. And I'm going to flick this over my card. I'm going to practice on my scratch piece first to see how. Very good, that's perfect. That's exactly how I want it to be. Grab a bit more, splash away down here. It's nice and wet. It will dry quite a bit lighter, remember. And this is why these pieces of paper on the back of the stamps are worth holding on to. I can just wash that off because it's a plastic paper. You can see none of that has gone onto the rose, but we've now got this beautiful spuddery background, which will dry lighter. In fact, this just wipes off with a paper towel. You don't even really need water for that, and that can go back in the case for next time. You can see how beautiful that embossing is. What a lovely image. It's a very lovely stamp. Now I'm going to adhere it to my card base. And there's our card finished. Your sweet friendship refreshes the soul. I hope you enjoyed today's project. Give it a try. It's easy to stay within the lines and the boundaries of this beautiful image when it is heat set embossed. Thanks so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. If you enjoyed this project, please remember to subscribe and click that like button. It really helps. Drop me a comment as well. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.